and I'm going to record it so that we can edit it later and circulate within our network. So it gives me great pleasure this afternoon to welcome Professor Blattman and Professor Nakarada. I want to say dobrodošli Profesorka Nakarada and Professor Blattman. Professor Blattman is in Chicago. Professor Nakarada is in Belgrade. The purpose of this afternoon's session is to hear thoughts and a discussion on I think a very important book, one which has certainly got me thinking, Why We Fight, a new publication. Some of us are surprised, and Professor Blattman, you'll take us through that a little, why someone who was working on development aid has moved to working on the conditions of war. A fascinating book, one which, as I was saying to Professor Blattman before we started, it took me a long time to understand what it was that was puzzling me about the book. And I think in the South African context, for me in particular, the methodology of the book is unexpected, compelling, and yet unusual for someone who has a background in history and philosophy and is very admired in the kind of the debates in public policy and around African studies. And that is this movement from the historical, from questions of the antagonisms which emerge between groups, the potential explorations of history and race and class, ultimately to a book that comes down to the decision-making around why we make war, when we make war, to ultimately quite human conditions. So I wrote, the book argues in effect that the reason groups may hate each other or be antagonistic are not the reasons they go to war. Instead, race and class and history may account for antagonistic identities, but decisions to go to war reveal the protagonist in their simply human condition, as Nietzsche would say, human or all too human. I don't know if you think that's a fair analysis of your book, but the resorts to psychology and social psychology, I think I found incredibly compelling. And it raises many questions. Professor Blattman, I want to ask you to introduce yourself, and Professor Nakarada, I want to ask you to introduce yourself when it comes to you. So, Professor Blattman, please, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So it's really nice to be here. I'm a professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, and I'm an economist and a political scientist. And what I've tried to do is write a book that is not really about my ideas. It's me trying to synthesize what I see as decades and decades of research from across the social sciences on this question of why groups fight. Did you want me to launch straight into the introduction of the book right now?
I'd be interested to know your own biography, if you don't mind. Something a little about yourself and your own trajectory as to how you end up on these specific topics.
Sure. I actually came to academia indirectly. I sort of found myself miserable working in business in Canada, which is where I'm originally from. And then I became impassioned about ideas of international development, especially early in my career. I was impassioned in terms of poverty alleviation and industrialization in Africa. And I was working in East Africa, especially all across Kenya. Concerned with, I think, this important thing that has to happen on the continent, which is industrialization, and then a series of accidents that I describe in the opening, the introduction of the book, brought me to northern Uganda in the last few days of its war. And I think everything that I had thought was important seemed to pale in comparison to what was going on, and I was completely perplexed by what was going on. I couldn't explain it. And so I think that for me became, the beginning of basically a 20-year journey trying to understand why some of these terrible events happen. A lot of my early work was trying to understand what are the effects of war on development, and then how do we alleviate that? So what does post-war reconstruction look like? But I think very quickly I began focusing on why groups are violent, why individuals and why groups are violent. And that for the last 10 or 15 years has been the basis of my work. And so I worked in East Africa on this. I spent a lot of time in West Africa, especially Liberia. About 6 years ago, I began working in Latin America, especially Colombia, more recently Mexico. Around 5 years ago, I began working here in Chicago as well, where we have a fairly serious urban violence problem. And so this is sort of, and then this book is, like I said, I was frustrated because somebody else should have written this book maybe 10 or 20 years ago. They could have written this book. And all these ideas that I was exposed to in my own work, the ideas I teach, the ideas I think that all these disciplines bring weren't in the public discourse. And so I got tired of waiting. And so I decided to sort of try to boil it all down for a broad audience in this volume.
You want to take us through? I mean, so I run a public policy think tank in South Africa, and so we're in South Africa is a very, very violent place. So we've been doing some work on policing and managing violence in South Africa. There's a very interesting idea which emerges from one of the great criminologists around gang violence, and he argues essentially that gang violence is not something which ordinary policing should manage. It has a specificity to it, which is outside of ordinary policing, which he argues in terms of social emergency, something of Blattman. This is why I think this framework is very interesting, both in South Africa, both thinking around the long-term future of political stability in South Africa, but also dealing with some quite ongoing public policy challenges around very, very high levels of organized violence. Do you want to take us through the book itself and some of its main arguments?
Sure. So I'll just share some slides. Can you see that all right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try to just give 5 ideas about the book, or 5 big ideas that I think certainly change the way I think about war. And so I hope they'll change the way you think about war. And the first one is the idea that enemies prefer to loathe in peace. And that seems especially a strange thing to say at this moment when the world's so focused on conflicts everywhere, not just South Africa, obviously what's happening in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What I like to remind people is that amazingly, this is rather the exception rather than the rule. 2 weeks into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, India accidentally fired a cruise missile at Pakistan. And in the ensuing weeks, calm ensued, as it has mostly for decades. So here are 2 adversaries who have essentially, loathe one another, have had a dispute that occasionally spurts up into brief violence, but they've generally avoided war. And likewise, even looking at Russia, you can sort of see essentially the last 20 years was evidence of Putin taking every single step and means possible to co-opt Ukraine short of invasion. And so in some sense, even then, war was his last resort. And in general, he's managed to co-opt several neighbors without invasion. Again, essentially, in some ways, this invasion of Ukraine, in order to exert influence in his region, is again the exception, not the rule. And I'm not saying this to sort of have us be complacent at all. I didn't write a book called Why We Don't Fight. I wrote a book called Why We Fight, because obviously we do. What I want us to recognize is, imagine if you were a doctor and you only ever saw critically ill patients, and somehow you were unaware that patients could get better, or worse, you were unaware that there were even healthy people in the world. Well, there'd be at least 2 problems. One is that you'd be demoralized. So I don't want us to be demoralized about conflict in the world. But secondly, you'd be rotten at diagnosis. And you'd probably prescribe all the wrong treatments as a result. And so we have to start with the premise that most of the time enemies don't fight, because it helps us, because it actually then helps us understand and diagnose when these long incidents of prolonged group fighting do occur. Okay, and the basic reason war is relatively rare is because it's so costly, because it's so ruinous. And there's a very simple sort of logic that's, I think, really fundamental in political science and economics in the way that it looks at war, right? And so this isn't the only lens to look at war, but I'm trying to give you a lens that comes from political economy. And it's the costs of war are an incredibly powerful incentive for compromise, because every time you have two enemies, right, they have a choice, whether it's an issue space or a country or a parliament or a territory. They can choose to divide that through negotiation. So two relatively equally matched parties, for example, could split that territory or split that issue space reasonably equally. Alternatively, they could fight, destroy a share of that pie, and then split it, or flip a coin for who gets to keep the whole pie. And basically, the point is that almost two adversaries can almost always find a split of the pie that they prefer to destroying it and then splitting a shrunken pie. And this was true, as I mentioned, even of Vladimir Putin, how he spent essentially he exercised every other means possible. So this is not to say that this sort of peaceful split is just or pleasant or doesn't use nefarious, damaging tactics. I don't want to sugarcoat this. I'm trying to say it's the absence of pitched battles. There's a big difference between the actions and the destruction and the cost and the ruin to both Ukraine and Russia, to what's happening today, to the kind of tactics that were used over the previous 20 years. And this is why everyone from villages to gangs to political factions within a country and nations strive to avoid these long, prolonged battles. The third point in the book is that there's a reason for every war and a war for every reason, and they're innumerable, but there's actually only so many reasons. That most of these reasons, one way to look at them and one way to essentially organize them, I'm trying to provide you in some sense of typology and a way to structure your diagnosis, is to recognize that we fight when we ignore the costs of war. And there's basically 5 main ways this happens. It happens when a society or its leaders are unaccountable, ideological, biased, uncertain, or unreliable. The first, I think, is pretty intuitive. It's the idea that war is costly, but an unaccountable leader, the person who's deciding whether or not to go to war, doesn't bear all of those costs because they don't personally pay them. And so they're too ready to use violence as a solution. And the extreme version of this is a personalized dictator, like Vladimir Putin, for example, who not only can afford to ignore many of the costs, but may have private agendas to preserve power that they may pursue in order to, through war, in order to hold on to power. All right, but this is not limited to personalized autocrats. And in the book, I talk about lots of democratic and quasi-democratic examples and how this too essentially makes many leaders too ready to use violence. The second reason is when we as a society or our leaders are ideological or we're pursuing intangible incentives. And so there's something that we get through fighting that makes us willing to pay the cost. So it's not that we overlook the costs, it's that we're ready to pay them. And if you think about one of the primary reasons you hear in the newspapers that Vladimir Putin launched this conflict, either for his own personal glory and place in history or for national status, essentially the glory of the Russian Empire and the Russian people accounting for past humiliations and so on and so on. There's so many of these different examples that these are all accounts of a ruler pursuing intangible or ideological goals and willing to pay the costs of fighting in order to attain them. The third reason we may ignore the costs is because we misperceive them. We misperceive the situation. Our leaders underestimate the costs, or they overestimate their chances of victory. And again, this is a story you hear in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine again and again and again. The claim that Vladimir Putin is isolated and insulated institutionally as a personalized dictator, and thus he's getting bad information, that psychologically, like many leaders, he may be inclined to be overconfident. He underestimated the costs, overestimated his ability to overrun Ukraine. These are all accounts that the war happened because of bias. Now, what these accounts all do, of course, is I think they place, in my mind, a little bit too much emphasis on bias, which is surely true, and a little bit less on what I would just say is the sheer uncertainty of the situation, which is an incredibly important source of potential conflict. Because between two adversaries at any level, the costs are always uncertain. So who would have guessed 5 months ago that, or rather, recall how uncertain 5 months ago it was, the strength, pluckiness, and resilience of Ukrainians, the capabilities of the Russian military, and the unity of Western governments in terms of sanctions. The idea that Russia would get a bad draw on all three of these things was within the realm of possibilities, but almost no one predicted that, least of all Vladimir Putin. And so amidst this uncertainty, fighting's always a gamble, right? And so it's this, but there's also a strategic element that enters in that I talk about in the book, which is that amidst this uncertainty, you also can never quite trust the signals of your adversary that they're strong, they're determined, because as in a game of poker, you're always worried that you know that they have an incentive to bluff. And so it's hard to resolve this uncertainty, right? It doesn't necessarily resolve on its own. And then the fifth way that many conflicts happen is when you're concerned that your adversary is unreliable. There were concerns of this in the beginning in Ukraine versus Russia. I think it's an even more powerful explanation for understanding why this conflict is difficult to end. Vladimir Putin and the Russian elite don't trust the Ukrainian government, a democratically elected government's ability to implement unpopular settlements. And indeed, they would say this is why it was difficult they didn't implement the former Minsk agreements. Likewise, Ukrainians and its allies are extremely concerned that Vladimir Putin would be willing to commit to any settlement. And there are deep concerns that he and his cabal would use whatever pause or moment or settlement to merely restart the war in some number of years to carve off Ukraine or former countries in the Soviet Union off slice by slice. All right. And so it's this fundamental unreliability of your opponent and their inability to commit to a deal that both starts and persists and leads towards to persist. One of the arguments I make in the book is that these five are sort of a lens through which we can look at all levels of conflict. So again, what I want to stress is this isn't so much a story of my book is right, all the other theories are wrong, right? Rather, I'm trying to give a lens through which we can organize existing theories, and not to say that they're right or wrong, but merely to sort of actually now recognize them for what they are and to sort of gain something from that. And I think we can do so at many levels of conflict, right? And so most of my day job is working on civil conflict, gang violence, and intervillage violence, for example. And these are extremely different from international warfare, for example. And indeed, they are. At the same time, I think we can learn a lot from what they have in common rather than from what separates them. And a good example comes from some of my work with gangs, both in Latin America, but here in Chicago. And I recall one gang leader very powerfully stands out to me, talking to me about how he became a killer. Now, there's many ways in which groups decide to fight. And there are many reasons that gangs, for example, on the streets of Chicago choose to fight. One of the answers you will hear is that very commonly is that they're basically engaged in vengeance. This is a blood feud because a decade ago, one gang killed somebody's father, and so they killed an uncle, and they killed a brother, and so forth. And so this is the pursuit of vengeance. The second reason is you'll hear is that it's a lot of hot, reactive, impassioned violence that happens in the moment, a response to a slight. But that wasn't the reason, and that's again a very common motive for violence here in Chicago. That's not the story he told me. He told me a third story. He said, when we started out as a drug selling gang, we were robbed repeatedly because they thought we were weak. And so we realized we'd either have to get out of this business or get killed, or we'd have to establish a reputation. And so we decided to hunt down the people who robbed us, and we killed them. And we had to do that a few times until we'd established a reputation for violence and strength. Now, why did he have to do that? Well, there is no need for reputation except in an environment of uncertainty, right? In a world where his strength and resolve was written on his forehead, he never would have been robbed in the first place because people could have judged the consequences, right? It was only by signaling his strength through costly action that he was able to, in the long run, establish a reputation and protect his rents. What I've just described are three different reasons that gangs fight that I think are extraordinarily common. One is some fight for these intangible and ideological incentives. This isn't irrational, right? The pursuit of vengeance is often a very stable and desire, one which after the fact they do not express regret. There are other times when we as humans and gangs in groups are biased in the sense that they act rashly. They underestimate the enemy, maybe underestimate the costs and consequences of their action, and they do have cause to regret afterwards. But this leader was telling me about the need for reputation in an environment of uncertainty, the strategic use of violence in order to protect him and his future profits and the people around him in future. Now, I said, I think this is one example of how these five sort of help us understand violence at every level. I think we can actually use these three things. This is actually how I personally understand the US invasion of Afghanistan. The idea that, yes, there was vengeance, a desire to see Al-Qaeda and the government that harbored it punished. That was clearly a motive of many Americans in the US administration. Yes, there were misperceptions and bias, perhaps not passions in the moment, though that may have been part of it. I think more of an institutional bias and intelligence failures, chronicled, I think, best by the great political scientist, Bob Jervis. But third is, I think, and often ignored, and we pay attention to these two. We pay attention to vengeance and the misperceptions and the mistake that this was. Very few people tell the story that I think is extremely important, not just for understanding why the United States entered, but then persisted in this conflict for 20 years, even when it seemed to be losing. And you can see the United States being perceived as weak internationally in the year 2000, 2001, that it could be attacked on its own soil and that it would never put boots on the ground. It might bomb your country, but it would never actually physically invade. And so the Bush administration and subsequent administrations engaged in a process of reputation building, much like this gang leader. And that reputation building arguably became even more important once they were losing, if only to send a signal to future adversaries, right? Because it made sense to settle this particular conflict, but to send a message to every future pariah state or every future potential terrorist group and every future potential adversary, this is how far we will go to deter invasion, right? And so you don't have to judge this as correct or incorrect or right or wrong any more than you might approve of this gang leader and his vicious pursuit of drug profits through criminal violence. I merely want us to understand it and sort of understand how we can look at these conflicts at every level through this lens. Because we're running out of time and I want to have time for chats, I'm not going to dwell on this, but I do want to emphasize the last message of the book, and indeed the last half of the book, is about how we get to peace, not just partly how we end the fighting in the moment, but also how we build a more resilient or more positive peace, one where there are fewer incentives, where we have some to sort of fall victim to these five forces that essentially build some insulation or padding. And in the book, what I talk about a war averted in Medellin, Colombia, a fight that broke out over a game of pool in a prison that one side pulled out its guns and shot on the other. And why they have guns in prison would be a whole other presentation. What happened next was a series of reprisal killings within prison that began to spill outside of prison, as you can imagine. And before long, every gang in the city lined up behind one side or the other, and the city geared for war. But that billiards war never happened. Okay, despite the city being filled with 400 warring, powerful, well-organized armed gangs, right, they decided to come to an agreement and avoid this conflict. And one of the reasons is because above each of these 400 street gangs, and this is sort of based on some other work we've been doing on the entire organization and structure of organized crime in Medellin. So each dot here is a street gang. Rather than being 400 autonomous gangs, there's rather about 17 confederations. And each confederation is headed by a small organization known as a rason, sort of like a mafia-like organization that coordinates and stops gangs within its own territory from fighting. Moreover, those 17 rason leaders have created a governing board sometimes called La Mesa, meaning the table, or La Oficina, meaning the office, where they essentially govern amongst themselves. And actually, instead of there being 17 razones, there's really sort of two main rason factions, right, that sort of struggle for control of La Oficina. And what La Oficina does is they not only, if a gang leader looks to be unchecked and unaccountable and ignoring the costs of their violence, if they're pursuing ideological and tangible objectives, or if they're misperceiving the situation and they're biased, well, they will provide strong sanctions and other incentives, if necessary at the point of a gun, to stop you from turning this into a conflict and igniting the city. Because these guys, everybody loses money when the gangs go to war. Nobody sells crack or marijuana in the middle of a gunfight. Nobody collects extortion in the middle of a gang war. All right, and so they are putting powerful incentives. And if there's uncertainty, well, this is what La Mesa is for, right? It's a bargaining table to sit down at, and they'll put those gangs, as they did after this billiards fight, and said, we're gonna work this out. And you think your enemy's unreliable, or there's this commitment problem that prevents you from actually finding a settlement? Well, we will provide commitment. We will guarantee deals. And so they're systematically trying to solve these 5 problems of conflict in order to get the gangs to stop fighting. And this is one reason why for the last 10 years, Medellin has had a homicide rate that's perhaps half of that in my home city of Chicago. And so, you know, this is a little, I use this analogy because I actually find the gangs of Medellin are an analogy for our world, right? We're not 200 fractious countries competing in anarchy, right? We're a handful of confederations with a dominant power lording over that confederation, just as, say, the United States does over the Americas, right? And helping keep the peace and coordinate peace within that. And then we're a handful of schisms between these confederations. And then we have these imperfect institutions like La Oficina, which we call the UN Security Council, right? And it's not equal. It's not, it applies its sort of peace selectively. It's imperfect to many, many degrees, but to the extent it does serve some of these functions, coordinating sanctions, forcing leaders to internalize the costs of conflict, combating ideological incentives, providing mediators on a bargaining table, sometimes providing commitments to deals. It's made the world a slightly more equal place, right? Not so much when one of the great powers wants to launch a war, any more than Medellin has held together when one of the most powerful Razón factions has decided to go to war. And that's when La Oficina falls apart. And that's when Medellin has gone to war. But in other respects, it has been a force for peace. And so there's obviously long lengths to go in the world to get to a more peaceful world. But the institutions we do have, to the extent they function, partly because they're rolling back the 5. So I will just leave it there and leave the rest of the time for discussion. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you so much. Again, I was just saying so much to think about there, and that last slide of showing the gangs of Medellin and the world, I think is a very disorienting and yet compelling view. Professor Nakarada, would you like to intervene at this point?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation, and I will just introduce myself in a couple of sentences. I'm a confused sociologist from the Balkans. We've gone through so many chapters that are perplexing and that have become sort of both a personal and professional obsession in our attempts to understand why all this actually took place. And I've been teaching peace studies at the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Belgrade for 20 years. From 2001, which means right after the wars ended. And I had the opportunity, for which I'm grateful, to listen and hear the youngsters that were traumatized by the experience and hear their questions, which were inspiring both for the discipline that I was dealing with and my own thinking. So at the moment I'm retired. Previously I worked as a researcher in 2 institutes, and I was a member of the Yugoslav Committee Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which was one of the unsuccessful attempts to invest into regional reconciliation. Our advisor was one of the participants and founders of the South African Committee, Alex Bahrain. So that's one metaphysical line of connection with the South African milieu. And I'll just mention a little detail from my life that I actually was in Ottawa during my childhood, where I learned English, so I have some connection with Canada as well. So maybe it's not an accident that we're talking today.
I grew up in Ottawa, actually.
I had an emotional reaction to your book because I liked the tone and the sincerity in it, which encompassed both the professional and the private aspect. I was inspired by the breadth of your approach from the micro level, which obviously seems to be your primary focus now, the local level, to the macro implications, the geography that you cover, but also the way that you fitted in your own personal life into this whole narrative. Expressing strong beliefs on the one hand, and at the same time, you were not embarrassed to say that they're posing questions and saying that you don't know the answers, and that you yourself continue to have open dilemmas. As a peace researcher, I was very happy to be in contact with an author who supports, in this long discussion that's been going on for decades, the viewpoint that war is not a genetically determined fate of humankind. And you obviously seem to be closer to what anthropologist Margaret Mead thought, that it was a social invention, and that war was created in our heads, and that's the space where we should dispense with it, meaning investing in education and dialogue. But also it's close to what Elise Boulding, one of the founders of peace studies, has been emphasizing during her life, that there are 2 histories, the destructive part of the history and the creative, cooperative, empathic part. And that we tend to forget the second part, which you also remind us, being impressed by the violence and the pain and suffering, more than by the brilliance and creativity of humankind, due to which we are still around. I don't know if we're going to continue to be around, but obviously we're around not because we were killing each other, but because we were cooperating and being solidaric sufficiently enough to come to this point of development. And of course, I was very appreciative of your attempt to affirm the value of peace itself, to focus on its in its own resilience and attraction, which I translate, and I did that in my own communications with the students, trying to impress them with this idea that peace is actually a translation of our value of life and the preciousness of life and the preciousness of community and solidarity and dialogue. So since you have this thread of optimism, pessimism, progress, and lack of progress, I would, as you did, support the optimism to the extent that it's recognition of some undeniable facts. There are, in terms of statistics and numbers, less violent conflicts, less victims, people are living better, the standard of life is better. And this is, I think, a needed part of the healing, because we are, I think, all overdosed by fear and apocalyptic scenarios that are constantly being presented to us. At the same time, you I think, this, affirm also the dialectics of peace, its value, but is also, as you say, wickedness, which I would translate into the complexity of peace. And I appreciate very much the emphasis on patience and gradualism and exploration of alternatives. And this is, I think, the space for creativity that is marginalized. However, there are a number of dilemmas and questions that I had. And in your opening statement, you've said you tried to synthesize the insights that have been around, but through various social disciplines. I feel paradoxically that the insights of the peace studies discipline is not sufficiently present. Even in terms of authors, Johann Galtung was not ever mentioned, and I think he's very important for your discussion in his distinction between positive peace and negative peace. And your book actually focuses mostly on negative peace. And I'm the last person who would minimize the importance of negative peace. This has often been a question within our own region, whether all the peace agreements were actually just ceasefires, and that in the long run they will, because of their inadequacies, because of not addressing the root causes, turn into another chapter of violence. But just the fact that people have stopped killing each other and destroying each other is of enormous significance, and it should be valued. But I think this is not where we should stop. And that's why, because you don't take in consideration positive peace, you don't take in consideration the idea not ending with compromises, but with transformation of conflict, where actors change their positions and goals and find spaces of cooperation through which they can dialogue and leave their entrenched positions maybe behind them. Also, there is no distinction between this direct violence and structural violence. And that's why I think, on the one hand, you say a couple of times in your big book, and you also mentioned it now, that peace does not necessarily need to be harmonious and promoting equality and social justice. Positive peace has to be. And I think this step should be made, at least theoretically, that if the gangs are not killing each other, that's an achievement. But it's an achievement within a distorted framework. So you have citizens who are living under structural violence who were being subservient to this type of violence, deprived of participation in decision making, of normality, a normal functioning society. So I think the celebration of this negative piece has to be problematized explicitly, that it's a limit that should not be the end of the story, but some part of the process, an important part, but not, as I said, the end of the story. And what was the praise of Ivor is in fact a little bit the basis of my second question, this common forces and logics that you summarized as well here in the introduction. I'm asking you is, do you think that this is an exhaustive list and that it has synthesized historical context that we're now in? And together with the paths to peace, the instruments that you describe, they show that the nature of the global order is not problematized at all. And I think whether it's unipolar or multipolar, whether it's Keynesian capitalist, social capitalism, or neoliberal capitalism dominating, whether the state is a sovereign actor or it's privatized and it's lost a number of its functions within the redistributive dimensions of the society and within the security, because there are now private jails, private armies, private police. They're taking over some of the functions of the state. So what does that mean in your discussion of the role of the state as a pacifier of conflicts? Do we need to talk about the nature of elites and classes, in spite of if the classes are promoting greed and selfishness and are very profit oriented and think that the universal formula of happiness is commodification of everything. At the same time, we have, as a result, extreme brutal inequalities within societies on the global level as well. There is this whole idea, narrative of the transnational elite as being those who have it all and want more. So this is a code. It's a psychological and anthropological code. Is that an important part of the story? And I'm wondering whether the idea that war is not the rule, it's an exception, and that war is costly, is true to a certain extent, but not entirely. Particularly now, if we read some of the criticism, for instance, of William Robinson, that in this global capitalism, he thinks that we have now a phenomenon of militarized accumulation, that war and repression have become an important source of profit. And you can find, I was surprised that it already exists, very quickly data which companies have profited in the few months or few weeks of war in Ukraine. They're the big defensive giants, and already there are numbers that their profits in total have increased by $500 billion of dollars. So there are some beneficiaries of these sufferings and destructions. And could then we think of them as new actors of power, non-transparent, not accountable, not reachable, not even recognizable. We don't know all the forces that are actually participating and promoting their interests, because that's their way of doing, but that are profiting. At the same time, the role of the media. I was just listening to one of the last interviews with Stephen Cohen that was made 3 years ago, and he was talking about the relationship between Russia and US and the problem of Ukraine as if he was talking now. He died in the meantime, unfortunately, but and one of the points he was making, and I support this, is that media and this whole surveillance culture, an additional form of control and disciplining, is so prevailing that it could be called malpractice, that for critical views, different views to appear in the mainstream, it's become increasingly difficult. So I would in total agree with the idea that humankind has progressed, and that there are obviously very articulate phenomena that testify to this. But I would paraphrase something that Rousseau says, that every chapter of progress produces new forms of enslavement, bondage, new failures. And I think that this is something that we have to deal with. So if at this moment I remind all of us that American historian Howard Zinn said that it's shameful that in the 21st century humans are still warring, in spite of the fact that it's less war. And contrast that with Pinker's conclusion that there are less wars. At this moment, I would pay more attention to Zinn's shameful feeling, because in the end, the number of wars don't matter. One war is sufficient to throw the whole planet into nothingness. If there's one nuclear war between two nuclear powers, that's the end of our progress, the end of probably of life. So I think that Kessler was right saying that a turning point was Hiroshima. And from that moment, humankind gained the potential to destroy itself as a species, and that we've continued at that space. No matter how many never agains we said, no matter how many agreements have been signed and initiatives to ban nuclear weapons, we've not stopped. And I think that's a big question, no matter what numbers we're dealing with in terms of conflicts and victims. And the question that I would also bring to the floor is a title from your book, subtitle says Trouble with Autocrats and Oligarchs. Well, I think it would be fair to add and Democrats, in spite of the fact that you do have critical insights about the democratic societies. Still, the idea is that actually autocratic regimes are more war prone. There are different statistics. There are those who questioning democratic peace produce statistics that it's not true. And if you take United States, the number of wars that it was involved with, the number of interventions, the number of bases it has around the world, the fact that it has the highest military expenditure, more, I think, than the next 10 countries or something like that. The fact that now internally, it seems so polarized ethnically, racially, urban-rural dimension involved too, that there are books being produced about the potential civil war within United States. So I think that democratic societies and their historical heritage have many things to be proud of, but also some very complex problems and things that need to be faced as a responsibility to the world. I think the colonial experience has not really been confronted the way it should be. The responsibility for the wars, for the concentration camps that were invented in Africa by the Germans and the Brits and the Spaniards in Cuba. And so Hitler was just implementing in Europe what was already experienced in Africa. These are all experiences that are not part of our past, they're part of our silence. And I think this silence is, again, a part of our story. And I'll end with just the last question related both to interconnectivity or globalization, the fact that interdependency has become a normal dimension of life and a factor of many problems. But to the dismay of many analysts, beginning with Norman Angell, who predicted in 1910 in his book, The Great Illusion, that the economic interdependency is so great that war is impossible because it would be too costly. So 4 years before World War I broke out, I think we, or most of us, would have thought that a war like this one in Ukraine was also belonging to an impossibility, particularly because it seems to have opened the door to a possible nuclear conflict because of all the energy dependence, economic dependence, food dependence, that it was not a realistic chapter. And here we are with all the uncertainties that this conflict carries. So it seems that interconnectivity, in spite of the fact that we have mingled more than before, we know more about each other than before, we are to a large extent still, in many cases, aliens to each other. And there are other interests like economic profits that seem to be more important than even survival. And in this context, this internal interconnectivity in Yugoslavia with intermarriages and economic dependencies didn't help and didn't prevent a series of tragic chapters and its violent destruction, which can be interpreted as in a stereotype way as a Balkan nature, aggressive nature, or it can be situated in a wider context, the end of Cold War and the internal external interactions that ended up in this tragedy. So as you see, I've read your book, I've underlined, I've written notes, and I'm sorry to have talked this long, but it's a reflection of the inspiration of your work and the concern for the questions that you raised. Thank you.
Radmila, thank you very much for those points. I want to give Professor Blattman an opportunity to reply, and then we've got about 20 minutes left. We can open up to the floor. Several very important points, and I was listening to a presentation which Mearsheimer made in Florence recently. A small audience, but I think one of the more important presentations of his, partly because there was a critical audience which engaged him, and the conversation was very interesting. But what was frightening about that conversation is his sense that we're very close to nuclear war, or that suddenly nuclear war seems very, very firmly on the agenda, partly because then he doesn't think of the primary protagonists in that war as Ukraine and Russia, but primarily between Russia and the US and NATO. And his arguments, and I wonder, Professor Blattman, if how this concept integrates into your framework around, and I was interested in the extent to which you're engaging with international relations theory here, around this idea of the purpose of the war is to knock, and this is his phrase, I think very, very, very a compelling one, to knock Russia out of the ranks of the great powers. And there it seems that the pursuit of that war, if he's right, which he might well be completely wrong, but nonetheless, there's a question of power and the pursuit of power here. And I was wondering how that question of power fits into your framework. It's a term that you don't use explicitly, although it's often implicit. But I wonder how it comes into this broader framework. Again, a very, very exciting engagement, and I think as well the book is so important that it deserves this kind of interrogation. And I think what's also important, and we'll make a fuss of the video that comes out of this. It's a book which I think is potentially very important in the Southern African context, or in Africa more generally. And yet, as we were talking, your approach is something which is very unfamiliar in African studies and in South Africa. And I suspect that's why we don't have a huge audience here, precisely because that kind of data-driven games theory modeling is something which is foreign in the South African context, and it's certainly something which at GAP we want to make people more aware of and more familiar with, precisely because it has such extraordinary explanatory power. Let me stop there and hand over to you.
Great. No, thank you. I'll just say, I think I do wish in retrospect I'd captured more of this idea of positive and negative peace. I agree that it's primarily, the first half of the book is primarily about negative peace. The second half tries to be about positive peace without maybe expressly using that framework, which is a useful one. And that is one of my regrets, is maybe not making that more clear. I think, one thing linking several of your comments was the idea that, I do believe that highly concentrated power, for example, oligarchy and autocracy, is a huge source of instability in the world. But I think for some of the same reasons, I do think this is what you talk about, is the ways in which power is concentrated in supposedly more democratic and equal societies, and how democratic and capitalist and neoliberal societies can also find themselves at war, as they do. I live in an incredibly unequal city, so perhaps not unlike many parts of South Africa. I guess I would argue that, and I live in a country, and I've taken citizenship in a country that's been aggressive in world affairs, right? As you pointed out. I guess I think that nonetheless, like, war is so costly, pitched battles are so costly that I would merely say, like, I think, why is it that I can live in a city cleaved by race, and yet the prospects, I think, of a war between blacks and whites in the city of Chicago is almost inconceivable. I think that's partly because of the power one side versus the other, but I think it's also because there's so many powerful incentives, right? And I would say the same thing about the United States. Yes, there have been wars, invasions in Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq, and these are obviously, but the United States has mostly pursued its ambitions in the world and its grip through every other means possible, right? And so invasion has typically been its last resort. And I'm not trying to put a moral judgment on that at all. I'm merely trying to point out that imperialists, elites, upper classes, whatever, almost always face incentives to pursue their aims through other, maybe nefarious, but less costly means, and avoid warfare. and thus, as I stress, peace is very seldom just. It can often be very unequal. And I think you point out that there are private actors in societies who will pursue political, in so-called, even in the United States, who, despite being democratic, despite being having incentives maybe for a capitalist peace, there are going to be individuals who will pursue power, pursue profit through warfare. And I think of those as those are the unchecked leaders, the unchecked interests, the lack of accountability. That first thing, I think that is one of the primary drivers of conflict, even in democratic societies. I don't want to go on for too long. I think you're correct. I think we can overstate the role of interdependence. I do think interdependence is an important force going towards positive peace. I think it's in some ways part of this transformation, or it's an element of the transformation you talk about. I think of it as speed bumps on the path to war. I don't think interdependence I think interdependence has probably deterred imperial powers like Russia or the United States, or ethnic groups, be it in India or Yugoslavia or elsewhere. I think it's deterred some things from happening, probably. I think it's probably prevented a certain amount, but it's like a speed bump. It's like putting speed bumps on a busy road. Like you haven't completely eliminated the risk of an aggressive driver. And so I don't want us to overstate the role of interdependence, but I think I want us to recognize it can probably help. And then, just you were to get to your last point about, my colleague, John Mearsheimer, who's across the midway here. I do, I agree. I think that, I think that all sides have been pursuing and always do pursue their own interests. And the United States and NATO would like to see and have long sought a weaker Russia, right? And I take that for granted. I think they're principally, I think that's partly driven by the how, I think in an alternate universe where Russia pursued a more democratic path, or basically wasn't as distinct a system with a distinct set of interests from the 1990s onwards, would have led to a very different world. And it seems to me, from my colleagues here who are specialists in Russia, that was a path that had some possibility of, there's some alternate universe where that happened. And it's not so implausible. It didn't. So I think the interests of the two of Russia and NATO are in conflict. I think so. I don't. But then I don't think that this was. I would still use my framework to understand why I think most of the time that conflict, that dispute between Russia and NATO, does not result in warfare. I think and why I think Ukraine is the exception. If we look over the last 80 years, I do think Ukraine is relatively unusual, and tragic. And I do share his. I have a slightly different analysis of the situation than him, but I think he raises important points that are at least partly true. I want to pause there because I want to be able to engage in some of these other questions, and in particular, maybe talk about South Africa.
Let's open this up. I mean, I'm especially interested because I think your framework is quite compelling for thinking around South Africa. I mean, I was in a taxi late last week in Cape Town, and the taxi driver was raised spontaneously and was vigorously defending the idea of independence for the Cape, which is something which hasn't really been heard of. Certainly not in my lifetime, apart from the pre-1910 moment. And I think it's a tiny, insignificant sensibility in South Africa. But this idea of fragmentation of the country is something which has been on the agenda for most of our history, especially it was the apartheid project was to disintegrate the country. One of the achievements of the democratic transition of 1994 was to overcome some of the tendencies towards secession, especially from within Zulu nationalism, which seems to have largely been contained in that respect. But I do worry that as the ANC weakens and fragments, and as the country's center begins to collapse, or certainly weaken fundamentally, whether there are a whole range of tendencies towards fragmentation and secession even, which does start to emerge. And the question then is in the back of my mind, a rather frightening question for me personally, and I think for generally in South Africa, is at what point would those forces potentially come to a decision that war makes sense for them, that war becomes an option? I think there's some very, very dangerous forces in South Africa. And I think your book has helped me raise the question, at what point can we begin to think around at what point sustained violence becomes an option for them? Let me stop there and open up. We've got about 10, 15 minutes. Are there any questions from the floor? If you are, you're muted, so please unmute yourselves. Or if you're having a problem, put up your hand and I'll unmute you. Is there anybody? Please don't be shy. I know that Raphael, you know the Colombian situation very, very well. I'd be fascinated to hear how it resonates with your understanding of the situation there.
Thank you, Ivor. It's not a question. I just would like to listen Chris, maybe his reaction on a subject, because I'm Brazilian.
Rafael.
Yeah, sorry. I am a Brazilian researcher now working here at GAP, and I get to know your work, Chris, when I was in Colombia, and I had I participated in a workshop made by Mr. Santiago Tobon. And then since then, I have been following your work on social networks and also your publications. And we have an interesting situation in Brazil where there is a radical difference between the way that the crime is organized in São Paulo and in Rio de Janeiro. And in São Paulo, what we have is not a pact between different factions of the organized crime, but in fact, what we have is a complete control of the state by one faction. And then we have some kind of pacts, since we have no dispute for territory in the state of São Paulo, which is the biggest one in Brazil. And what you have in Rio de Janeiro is it's a contrast. It's a completely balkanization of the control of the territory by multiple factions. So we have very different models of governance, and we have a very, very lower crime indicators in São Paulo in comparison to Rio. It's almost a different country, you know. The number of murders and so on are very different in the two countries, and the cities are not far away. They are, you know, you can go to Rio by car in 5 hours by car. So it's very interesting to get to listen you talking of the Medellin situation, because they could made a pact between very different factions in the city, and so maybe this is something that we could achieve in Rio, you know, because it's you have a scenario of almost a civil war in the city in some areas. And I don't think that the São Paulo situation it's a benchmark, because it's something that you know, it was not something that the government achieved, but it was something that the criminal networks, the difference that they work in each city. So I don't know if you have ever made some work in Brazil, in the field in Brazil, but it would be nice to listen your reaction to this. And yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, and this relates to maybe not the South African question, Ivor, that you raised, but also the question of gang violence and inter-gang conflict, and then conflict between gangs and the state in many cities that are a lot of countries are facing. I think you see a number of patterns. So gangs do have incentives, as they did in Medellin and in Sao Paulo, they make more money when there's peace. In a situation where you can have a monopolist over the criminal world, I think it's the Red Command in Sao Paulo. That now you have two adversaries. You have the state and the Red Command, and the Red Command has managed to criminally govern the entire country. Occasionally you get not a criminal monopolist, but a criminal oligopoly, like you get in Medellin, that managed to stitch together a peace, which is harder to do with many actors. The incentives for peace I laid out in the book are really simplest when you have two adversaries, like Russia versus NATO, or the state versus the Red Command, right? An oligopolistic peace is harder to put together, because there's always one person who might have incentives to defect, or one group. So you also had instances like Chicago. Chicago had an oligopoly of criminal governors, like Rio does, and like Medellin does, and then like Rio, they never managed to find that peace, because it can be difficult. Also, those oligopolistic pieces amongst criminal actors can be disrupted by the state, right? When the state decides to go to war against them. And I think that may have been what part of the story in Chicago, and you could argue that's part of the story in Rio. But even without that state war against oligopolistic actors, that essentially makes it very difficult to make a criminal peace. I'm not sure that in Rio or Chicago, those oligopolistic criminals would have, I think maybe after many years or decades, they would have built the structures and institutions to create a criminal peace. And so I don't know how that works in South Africa, actually. But I do think it's an interesting, in terms of this inter-gang war, that's very different than the kind of societal conflict and secessionary tendencies and fractionalization and fragmentation that you were talking about, Ivor. But it does point to the difficulty of, like, I think one oversimplification in my book is that these incentives for peace, all of these 5 factors are in some sense harder to solve when you have many actors competing over the pie, right? It's often, and it's in some ways you could argue it's a reflection of the commitment problem. And I get into this a little bit in the book, but it sort of takes us to like a much, I think, more sophisticated level of strategy than I got into. But I think that these powerful incentives for peace can start to break down when you have many groups squabbling. And that might be a situation of some of these societies like South Africa, like my home country of Canada for many decades, and so forth.
Anybody else? Ranjini? I mean, Ranjini, you're from KwaZulu-Natal, which is a province which is looking increasingly fragile. Does any of this resonate with your sense of things in that part of the world?
Good afternoon, everyone. So just to introduce myself, I'm a political journalist. I'm working now at GAP as a media strategist. But to just respond to what I was asking me about KwaZulu-Natal, the province I'm from, is that just to give you a little bit of background, our democratic settlement was in 1994. And large parts of South Africa kind of calmed down in terms of political violence within the next 5 years, but continued to rage in KwaZulu-Natal long after that settlement. And the reason for that was that conflict was politicized, always, historically, sort of people's political allegiances were weaponized. And that led to about 30,000 people dying during the 80s and early 90s. And what we had then, I remember someone describing it was not an absence of violence. I mean, it wasn't a situation of peace, but an absence of violence. Even after there was a peace accord between the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party. But what you have now is that the politics around the former president, Jacob Zuma, is attempts to resuscitate political violence in this province, because it's handy to be able to use that history of violence and use people's emotions and allegiance to the former president, and weaponize it in terms of the battles in the ANC. And so you have people like the former president's daughter, who is key to inciting incidents of violence, such that like what we had in July last year, a month-long spate of violence. And there are further threats that if he gets prosecuted, if the former president gets prosecuted, that there will be more outbreaks of violence later this year. So it's interesting that on a global scale, how this can be used, and domestically, how the threat of war and political violence can be used, and used effectively as a weapon in in factional battles as well as global face-offs. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to say anything? Yelena, do you have any last comments? Mzalemo, I don't know you, or Barbara Blattman. And I think it's going to bring this to an end. Radmila, do you have any final comments?
Final. Well, I certainly hope that Professor Blattman has gained an image of what his book means in different regions and how we relate to it in accordance with our own experiences, and that this is the beginning of perhaps a longer dialogue and professional, mutual professional communication, because I think this is absolutely the most important question that we're facing, both as individuals and researchers, how to survive in at least a more humane way the wickedness of all these forces and problems. So I was happy to listen and participate in this conversation, which I hope is one of the few next ones that are awaiting us.
Yeah, I think, and on that note, I would like to thank Professor Blattman. I do hope that this is an opportunity to continue this conversation. I think it would be very interesting to apply some of your lenses to the South African scene, which I think is an especially interesting one, or within Southern Africa, which is a very dynamic region. South Africa, of course, is a both parochial and yet historically very important site of all sorts of forces. So it would be very interesting to see how and where we go with regard to why we fight or why we don't fight. I'll give you a minute to wrap up. I also just want to thank Yelena Vidojevic, who happens to also be my wife, who's also a former student of Radmila, for arranging this seminar. Thank you very much for reaching out to Professor Blattman, to inviting Radmila for arranging today. We were small in number, but I think the conversation has been very rich, and I think the potential of future conversations is even richer. Professor Blattman, the last word over to you.
No, Radmila's comments made the hour for me, especially. They were so helpful and thoughtful, and I learned a lot from really all these comments and conversations. So this was fabulous for me. And I hope, I brought the mission of the book was to just sort of stimulate these discussions. I look forward to learning more about the South African context. Two of the three main graduate student advisees I have are actually working on different aspects of South African history and in the economy right now. And so I've become for the moment, a student of what's happening in South Africa indirectly. And, and it is such an important part. I will say it is such an important part of the planet, and it's a tension and set of conflicts that has, there's a handful of places in the world where I think the implications for those societal disputes spill well beyond their borders and are sort of take this global historical importance, and South Africa is maybe chief among them. And so I look forward to being able to learn more about this and speak more to it in future.
So maybe we can arrange going forward a project where we can bring you out here, or you can at least play your mind to some of our dynamics. On that note, I want to thank everyone for joining us. I think it's been a very valuable afternoon. And good morning to Professor Blattman, and goodbye to everyone else. Good evening to everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.